My sister gave up her youth to raise me, and they called her used goods. I was raised by Sophia in a 2-room walk-up above a corner store in Wilmington. She was barely out of high school when she became my mother, my father, and every shield I had against the world. I'm Elena Hart, 28 costume designer for a local theatre company. And this is the story of how I learned that love, even the kind that feels safe, can still hurt you when it refuses to stand beside you. I don't remember what kind of wine they were serving. I don't remember the name of the pianist playing in the corner or how many forks were arranged beside my plate. But I remember the silence. I remember the air being pulled out of the room the moment Julian's mother turned to my sister and said with that soft, controlled smile she wore like armour, "Your sister's divorced well." I suppose some reputations are harder to restore. The words landed gently like snow, cold and quiet, and yet I felt them slam through the centre of my chest. Sophia didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her hand, the one holding the glass, tightened just slightly. Her jaw tensed, and I knew exactly what she was doing, locking the reaction inside. That same way she had when we were kids, and someone at school mocked the second-hand shoes she bought me instead of a prom dress. Or when our landlord called her just a girl for trying to negotiate our rent. That same look contained pain, the kind you swallow so it doesn't eat your pride alive. I turned to Julian. I didn't say a word, I didn't need to. I was asking with my eyes, will you let this stand? Will you defend her, defend me, us? But Julian just shifted slightly in his seat, blinked slowly, and after a beat, took a sip of wine. That's all. No glance in his mother's direction, no pushback, no discomfort, just a pause and a swallow. And in that tiny gesture, so small, anyone could have missed it, I heard everything he wasn't saying. I had once believed that love, real love, was armour, that it was protection from the world's casual cruelty, that when you found someone who saw you, who said they'd build a life with you, they'd also be the one who'd stand in the way of the blow, not lean away while you took it. I believed that about Julian. I believed that because he'd held my hand through nights when I doubted myself, because he'd watched me work late in my tiny apartment and said he admired my dedication, because he once told me he loved how I didn't care about status or pedigree. And yet, here we were surrounded by fine china and $1,000 floral arrangements, and my sister, the woman who raised me, fed me, fought for me, was being labelled damaged goods in front of a room of people sipping cocktails like nothing happened. And the man who said he wanted to marry me said nothing. My skin felt too tight for my body. The walls of the dining room with their elegant wallpaper and gold-framed portraits seemed to lean in like they were watching. There was laughter, somewhere nervous. Performative, maybe from Julian's aunt, or one of those faceless second cousins who flew in for this family moment. The clink of silverware resumed. Someone cleared their throat. The pianist kept playing. But for me, the room froze. It felt like my body was moving in slow motion, even as my mind raced ahead. I saw the version of myself I had been for the past year, trying adjusting, softening edges that used to be sharp. I remember Julian laughing the first time I corrected someone who called my costume work just sewing. He'd said, "You're fiery." But later that night, he'd asked me to tone it down around his colleagues. I remembered how I started saying less during his family brunches, how I stopped wearing my favourite silver earrings because his mother once joked they looked handmade, how I smiled through little digs that stung, thinking I was doing the mature thing, compromise, grace. But here's the truth, No one tells you about shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's world. Eventually, you disappear. I glanced at Sophia again. She was calm, composed, but I knew she was only staying seated for me. She wouldn't make a scene. She knew I'd spent months believing this family was becoming mine. She wouldn't risk disrupting that. But I felt the tremble just beneath her calm because I knew her. Because her pain was the mirror of mine. I used to think love was enough. That if I loved him enough and tried hard enough and fit well enough into his curated life, everything would work out. But what I learned that night as my fiancé stayed quiet and his mother rewrote my sister's worth with a single sentence was this: love without respect is performance. And self-respect is the only thing that keeps you standing when everything else collapses. I looked down at the ring on my finger. It was beautiful, of course. Vintage. Subtle. Julian said he picked it because it was unlike what his mother would expect, and I'd loved him for that. But now I wondered, was it truly rebellion, or just another way to pretend I belonged in a world that only made room for me when I played along? I traced the edge of the napkin on my lap, felt the weight of the silence between us stretch thin. I didn't move. Not yet. But something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter, like a door unlocking or a breath being held too long finally released. And as the room returned to its rhythm, small talk wine refills someone asking about the next course. I sat there wondering how I got here. Not just to this table, but to this silence. To this moment where I found myself frozen between who I used to be and what I was becoming. I thought of Sophia. She was 17 when our mother died. I was 9. Our father was already gone by then, one of those men who thought disappearing was a better solution than staying and trying. So it was Sophia who held our world together. She dropped out of college, took a job at a diner, and figured out how to fake adulthood for the sake of a little girl who cried herself to sleep for months. I remember the way she used to wake up early to press my school uniform, even when she had to be at work by 6. The way she'd make dinner out of whatever was left in the fridge, humming as if pasta with ketchup was a 5-star recipe. She never let me feel poor. She made our tiny apartment feel like a place that mattered. And when I got older, and she saw that I had a thing for colours, textures, the way fabric moves on a body, she saved up to buy me a second-hand sewing machine. Said, "You don't have to do anything big with it. Just start." Years later, she married a man who said all the right things. He had money, a steady job, the kind of life she thought might finally give her a break. But he didn't want a partner. He wanted someone to shrink beside him. 2 years in, he cheated, blamed her for being too independent. She came back home carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a weight she never put into words. And still, she laughed with me that first night back, like she hadn't just been gutted. "I should have known better," she said, pouring us both tea. But at least now I know not to make the same mistake twice. I promised her I'd never forget what it took for her to start over. Well, then I met Julian. I was backstage at the community theatre, mending a costume 2 hours before curtain. The sleeve had ripped during dress rehearsal, and no one else knew how to fix it quickly. I was crouched on the floor, needle in hand, when he stepped in. He wasn't flashy, just confident in a quiet way, polished. That kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about rent or bus schedules. "That looks like magic," he said, watching me stitch. I laughed. "It's just thread and time." He didn't leave. just sat on a nearby crate and asked if I'd always done this kind of work. Most people saw what I did as a minor forgettable. He looked at it like it mattered. I found out later he was one of the theatre's donors attending rehearsals as part of some arts patron committee. I expected him to be bored or condescending. Instead, he asked questions that felt sincere. We ended up talking for 20 minutes about costume design, and when I finally looked up from the sleeve, he was smiling like he'd just discovered something. "You free after this?" he asked, and I almost said no, but something in his voice disarmed me. That night, we shared coffee at a 24-hour diner down the block. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was never to impress, only to connect. He told me he studied literature, loved minimalist theatre, had a complicated relationship with his family's legacy. "My mother thinks my real job is making her proud," he said. I remember thinking he sounded lonely despite everything he had. From then on, it was coffee dates and gallery visits, walks through the city with no destination. He came to tech runs just to sit backstage and keep me company while I pinned hems. He said I was unlike anyone he knew, that I reminded him of what was real. I didn't know what to do with that kind of attention. It felt like being seen through a window you didn't realize was open. And when he kissed me, finally, I didn't overthink it. I just let myself believe maybe this time I was allowed to want something that didn't come with a catch. He didn't introduce me to his family right away, said they were complicated, traditional, always analysing. I didn't push. I wasn't ready for anyone to reduce me to where I came from, and Julian never made me feel like I needed to be more. At least not at first. The first red flag came wrapped in compliments when he said, "You're different from other women I've met." It sounded sweet then. Now I know better. Different was code for not a threat, for someone who wouldn't challenge the script. But back then, I wore it like a badge, like I'd won some quiet competition I hadn't even known I was part of. I thought I was special. I thought love, real love, meant you could finally breathe. But sitting there in that dining room under chandeliers and painted smiles, I realised I'd been holding my breath the whole time. There had been moments scattered and subtle that should have warned me. But I wanted the story to be true so badly, I edited out the parts that didn't fit. At first, being with Julian felt like a quiet miracle. He made room for me in his world, without asking me to leave mine. He loved the way I saw beauty in everyday things, said it grounded him. We talked about books, obscure art, shows our favourite late-night meals. He listened when I spoke, looked at me like I was the only voice in a noisy room. I fell for him in moments, not declarations. The way he held open a bookshop door, or sent me photos of textiles he saw while travelling, or showed up to my fittings with coffee just how I liked it. For a while, it felt simple. Sophia noticed the change first. One night over takeout on our old couch, she said, "I like him. He seems different. Just make sure you don't have to shrink to fit someone's world." I smiled, shook my head. "He's not like the others?" And I believed it. Because Julian didn't insult my work, didn't laugh at my background, didn't act embarrassed by my thrift store wardrobe. That felt like progress. Until it didn't. The first time he skipped inviting me to a family event, he said, "It's just a board thing. Super boring. All numbers and wine snobs." I laughed, relieved. But when it happened again and again, I began to wonder. Once, I offered to come along to a gallery opening. "That crowd, they wouldn't get you," he said, then quickly added, "I mean, they'd love you, obviously, but they can be traditional." That word, traditional, It became a blanket for everything unsaid, a reason to delay, to excuse to sidestep. I told myself he was protecting me. But sometimes protection and exclusion feel eerily similar. Still, I stayed. I started wearing heels more often, swapped my vintage jackets for sleeker silhouettes. I didn't ditch who I was, not exactly, but I adjusted, smoothed the edges, learned the names of wines I couldn't afford the difference between modernist and brutalist architecture. I said less in rooms where I once would have filled the silence with questions. I wanted to fit. Not because he asked me to change, but because I feared what would happen if I didn't. When we travelled, I made sure my outfits matched the tone of the place. When he brought me to meet his work friends, I smiled more, listened more. I wanted them to see what he saw. Sometimes Julian noticed. "You're glowing tonight," he'd whisper, and I'd glow even brighter. But there were other times, like when I mentioned Sophia in a conversation and he tensed ever so slightly. "She seems intense," he said once. "Protective." "She raised me," I replied. "Right," he said, like he'd forgotten. "Sophia never pushed, she just watched carefully." Once she asked, "Do you still design for yourself?" "You used to spend hours on those passion pieces." "Been busy," I said. "Just don't lose your voice," she said. "Not even for someone who loves the sound of it." I laughed it off, because I wasn't changing. I was evolving. Right. But love isn't meant to feel like a performance. And slowly, I began to realise I wasn't just dressing for Julian's world. I was erasing parts of mine. My first visit to Julian's family home was orchestrated. That's the only word that fits. Everything was curated, polished, coldly perfect. The driveway wound through trimmed hedges that looked like they'd been measured with rulers. Inside, the air smelled like a department store, not bad, just sterile, as if emotions might leave a mark. Julian adjusted his collar before ringing the bell. He smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. I remember thinking I should be nervous, right? But what I felt was something else. Like I was already being measured against a list I hadn't seen. His mother opened the door herself. She was elegant in that sharp, effortless way that comes from money and generations of knowing how to use it. "Eleanor," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "We've heard so much." I couldn't tell if that was a good thing. Dinner was served in a room too large for conversation. A chandelier hung like judgment over the table. Julian's father asked a few polite questions about my work, nodding with disinterest. It was his mother who smiled as she said, "Costume work, like tailoring." She tilted her head, genuinely curious in that way people are when they're trying to understand how something matters. "I design and construct costumes for theatre productions," I explained. "It's part visual storytelling, part engineering." "How charming," she said. The smile didn't reach her eyes. Julian chuckled light and quick. "Elena's being modest. She runs the whole costume department." Then he changed the subject. Just like that. No pause to let me finish, no support to help me expand. The message was clear. Let's move on. I took a sip of wine and smiled through it. I told myself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just formality. But as the night went on, I noticed the little things. The way Julian laughed more at his father's dry jokes than he did at mine. The way he shifted slightly when I reached for his hand under the table. How he corrected me gently when I mentioned a mutual friend from the theatre world. "You mean your co-worker," he said. "No one was rude, not overtly." But that was the thing about polite disdain. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to let the silence do the work. They didn't mock me. They minimized me, subtly, elegantly, and Julian let them. After dessert, his mother walked me through a hallway lined with family portraits. "You know," she said, "this house has seen 3 generations of tradition. We're rather proud of continuity." "It's beautiful," I replied, because what else could I say? "Julian tells me you grew up in the city," she continued. "With your sister? That must have been challenging." Her tone wasn't unkind, just curious. But something about the way she said "your sister" made it sound like Sophia was a footnote, a burden I'd carried. I wanted to say that Sophia had been the most consistent part of my life, that she taught me how to sew, how to listen, that her laugh had carried me through entire winters. But I didn't. I just nodded. Later in the car, Julian squeezed my hand. "They liked you." I turned to him. "Did they? They're just formal. It's not personal." But it was. It had to be. And it wasn't their disdain that hurt. It was his silence while they handed it to me. His world didn't just look different. It moved at another rhythm, quieter, sharper, full of curated gestures and unspoken boundaries. His family's home was like a museum grand, but cold each corner, perfectly manicured to impress, without ever really welcoming. I wore a navy wrap dress I'd spent 2 weeks debating over, and still felt underdressed the moment I stepped in. His mother greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Costume work?" she asked as we stood near the piano room, her champagne flute catching the chandelier light. "Like tailoring," Julian chuckled, lightly deflecting. "Elena's work is more conceptual. She's very creative." Then he turned the conversation to wine pairings. It wasn't the mislabeling that stung. It was the way no one wanted to understand, and how quickly Julian let them change the subject. I'd spent years building my own name in theatre, stitching dreams into seams, telling stories in silhouette and fabric. But that night, I was just a quirky accessory to their curated dinner. I kept my voice measured, my expressions soft, but inside something pulled back. Something that had wanted so badly to belong. I turned to him. They're just formal. It's not personal." But it was. It had to be. And it wasn't their disdain that hurt. It was his silence while they handed it to me. We stopped talking about it after that night. Julian didn't bring it up again, and I didn't push, but something unspoken lodged itself between us. I started noticing how often he sidestepped questions about the future. "We'll figure it out," he'd say, whenever I mentioned visiting Sophia more, or inviting her to a work dinner, or how we'd blend our lives after marriage. Sometimes I wondered if we were blending anything at all, or if I was just dissolving into his plans. When his friends came around, things didn't get better. They talked over me at dinners, nodding absently when I mentioned a show or a design project, and then pivoting to real estate tech startups or some exclusive ski resort. One of them once described my work as that crafty stuff you do with theatre kids. Julian laughed it off. "Elena's got her creative world. You'd be surprised how intense her deadlines are." I smiled. Pretended I didn't hear the phrase "crafty stuff" echoing like a paper cut. Sophia saw through it before I did. One Sunday morning over coffee, she looked at me, really looked at me and said, "You're quieter than you used to be." I shrugged. "Maybe I'm just tired." She shook her head. "No, you're shrinking, Elle, bit by bit, trying to make yourself small enough to fit where you were never meant to squeeze into." I wanted to protest to defend the life I was building with Julian, but the words wouldn't come, because a part of me knew she was right. Still, when Julian proposed, I said yes. It was just us in the park where we'd had our first late-night walk. He knelt beside a wrought iron bench, held out a vintage ring I might have picked myself, and said, "I can't imagine a future without you." No big speech, no audience, just quiet and personal like most of our sweetest moments. And I said yes, of course I did. But later, walking home under amber streetlights, something felt off. Not because I wanted fanfare, not because I needed a fairy tale, but because the most important moment of our relationship had no room for my sister, no call to her before, no plan to celebrate after. Just Julian and me in a world that seemed to be shrinking around us. And the hollow I felt wasn't about the proposal. It was about everything we'd left out. Julian called it a celebration, a family dinner to mark the engagement and welcome me into the fold. He said it with that signature softness, the same one he used when asking for forgiveness, after forgetting something small. I said yes, of course, thinking it would be a moment to stitch our worlds together. I asked if Sophia could come. "Of course," he replied too quickly, as if the answer had been memorised rather than meant. She was my only family. It wasn't a question. The evening started with rain, thin, steady and cold, like nerves dressed up in weather. We pulled up to the Thorn Estate lights, glowing behind tall hedges, a line of black cars already neatly parked out front. I adjusted the sleeves of my navy dress, one I had borrowed from a friend because the ones I owned felt too fun for the occasion. Julian barely looked at me as we walked in, his phone still in hand, from checking a message probably from his mother. The house smelled like polished wood and old money. Inside, the air was thicker than expected, heavy with expensive perfume and unsaid things. Sophia stood close to me, her grip on my arm tighter than usual. She'd worn a simple black dress, the one she wore to interviews. Her makeup was soft, dignified. I thought she looked beautiful. I also knew they wouldn't see her that way. Julian's mother greeted us at the door. "Eleanor," she said with a nod that passed for a welcome. Her eyes flicked to Sophia. "You must be her sister." It wasn't a question, it was a diagnosis. Before I could speak, she added, "How lovely that you could make it." Dinner began with champagne. The clinking glasses were more choreographed than celebratory. Guests I hadn't met before congratulated Julian, and then turned to me with thin smiles and questions that sounded like compliments but weren't. "And you work in costume? Design, that must be so fun." "How creative. Did you study fashion?" "What a unique little career path," I answered politely, my voice steady. Sophia didn't say much. She stayed near me until we were seated. They split us up. I was across the table from Julian. Sophia was beside me on the left, but there was always someone talking across her, never to her. The man seated to her right was one of Julian's uncles. He didn't ask her a single thing. Julian laughed at the right moments, toasted at the right time, but never looked at me longer than he had to. I watched him more than he watched me, noticing how easily he melted into their rhythms, how his voice changed when he spoke to his father, lower, more careful. He told stories from his college days that I had never heard, ones that didn't include me. It felt like watching a play where I only knew one character, and tonight that character had no lines. Sophia picked at her food. She smiled when someone glanced her way, but it never made it to her eyes. Her knuckles were pale where they gripped her napkin. I leaned toward her and whispered, "Okay." She nodded too quickly. "It's just a lot," she whispered back. I reached under the table, gave her hand a squeeze. Dessert came, something delicate with flecks of gold leaf. The kind of thing you're supposed to admire before eating. A toast was made by Julian's father about legacy and commitment. It included phrases like shared values and building a life that reflects our standards. No one mentioned love. When they clinked glasses again, I didn't lift mine. I looked to Julian. His glass was raised. His eyes found mine too late. And in that glance, I realised I was a guest in my own engagement. The toast came near the end of the third course, when the candles had burned lower and the wine had dulled just enough judgment for sharp tongues to soften into social cruelty. Julian's mother stood smile, painted perfectly crystal glass, held with years of etiquette. To new beginnings, she began eyes sweeping the table before landing squarely on me. And let's hope the bride-to-be doesn't inherit too much family baggage. There was a pause, then laughter. Polite, controlled. The kind that cuts deeper because of how effortlessly it tries to hide the blade. I felt Sophia still beside me. Her fingers stopped mid-reach for the bread. Her body went stiff like she was trying not to flinch. My chest tightened. Julian leaned closer, squeezed my hand like he was comforting a child who didn't understand the joke. "Ignore her," he whispered. That was the moment. That was the exact second I knew. It wasn't just the insult, it wasn't even the laughter. It was him. Choosing silence, choosing comfort, choosing not to rock the boat. My eyes went to Sophia. She wasn't looking at anyone, just staring down at her lap where her hands clenched the napkin with quiet control. She had raised me through grief, worked overtime jobs to pay for my dance lessons, skipped her own college dreams so I could chase mine. She used to come home late, her apron still smelling of fryer oil, and sit beside me while I did homework at the kitchen table. She was never just a sister. She was the person who showed me what strength looked like when no one applauded. And this room, a room I once thought I wanted to belong to, looked at her like she was less. Like the years she gave were a stain on me. My heartbeat steadied. I blinked once twice as the chandelier above blurred into soft gold. The weight of expectation in that room of performance of restraint had become too much to hold. I stood, slowly, deliberately. My chair scraped against the marble floor like a protest. Conversations hushed. Forks paused midair. Someone cleared their throat. "Is something wrong, darling?" Julian's mother asked, her voice syrupy sweet. I took a breath, slipped the ring off my finger. The silence that followed was absolute. I held it between my fingers, not trembling, not hesitating, and set it gently beside my plate. Julian's face paled. "Eleanor, what are you—" "I thought I had to be good enough for this family," I said, my voice clear, almost calm. "I thought if I dressed right, spoke right, made myself small enough, I'd fit. But now I know I never needed to be part of it." Gasps, a stifled cough, the sound of Sophia standing with me. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. I turned and walked out, heels clicking with more clarity than I'd felt in months. Behind me, someone called my name. Julian, maybe? I didn't look back. I didn't want to see another blank stare or hear another excuse. As we moved through the hall, past portraits of ancestors who would never know my name, I remembered the way Sophia used to hold my hand when I had nightmares. How she taught me to thread a needle. How she once pawned her necklace so I could attend a school dance. The front door of their grand house opened into night. Cool air hit my face like a benediction. I stepped into it, my hand finding Sophia's. She gave it one firm squeeze. We didn't speak until we reached the car. And even then, all she said was, "Took you long enough." I let out a breath that felt like a release. Maybe it had taken too long, but I'd finally come home to myself. We were halfway down the stone path, heels echoing off the quiet drive when Julian's voice pierced the night. "Eleanor!" His tone was sharp, desperate in a way I hadn't heard before. I turned back just enough to see him on the steps, his suit jacket wrinkled from leaning against something too long, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Don't ruin something over a moment," he said, hands half raised, pleading. The porch light haloed behind him, making him look both ethereal and incredibly small. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to. Part of me still longed to make it easier for him, to explain, to soften the edge. But I stood there in the wet night air, letting the rain mist against my skin, and I realised I didn't owe softness to someone who couldn't stand up for me. So I said it, quietly, clearly. That moment showed me everything. Sophia was already unlocking the car. The door thunked open as Julian took one step forward. I shook my head, not in anger, in finality. Then I turned and left him there suspended in the glow of his own indecision. The ride home was quiet, not awkward, not heavy, just spacious, like breathing after months of holding it in. Sophia drove with both hands on the wheel, the way she always did when she was centering herself. I looked out the window, watching streetlights streak across the glass like old film. I thought of all the times I'd ignored what I felt for what I thought I should feel. All the times I explained away discomfort because I didn't want to seem ungrateful, because love is supposed to be enough, right? When we got back to our apartment, I kicked off my shoes at the door. Sophia handed me her old robe, the grey one with a rip at the pocket we never bothered fixing. She didn't ask what happened. She just filled the kettle and pulled down 2 mismatched mugs. We sat on the couch, the same one we'd bought second-hand 6 years ago, where we'd once watched bad TV under the same blanket. She handed me a mug without a word. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic, grateful for the heat. We didn't cry. We didn't unpack it like a therapy session. We just sat. There was something sacred in that silence, something whole. I thought back to a night 4 years ago. Julian and I had only been dating for 2 months. He had invited me to his friend's apartment for drinks. They all wore smart sweaters and spoke in clipped tones. When I mentioned my latest show, a gritty reimagining of a Tennessee Williams piece, someone laughed and said, "Oh, so you make the costumes for community plays?" I smiled politely. Julian didn't correct them. He changed the subject to European wine. I told myself then it didn't matter. That love would bridge the differences, that their world would make room for mine. But it didn't, and it never tried. Sophia broke the silence. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." She looked at me. "Was it him? Or was it them?" "Both," I said, "but mostly me, for staying quiet for so long." She reached over and touched my knee. "You're not quiet now." We drank our tea, let it go cold. She curled up at one end of the couch. I stayed at the other. The TV blinked silently. The rain tapped at the window like a lullaby. And I realised something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. Until now, walking away doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes it comes with stillness. A door closing without a slam. A ring left on a table. A breath finally released. In that quiet, I started to return to myself. Not with fireworks, but like water finding its level. And that was enough. The next morning, there were 3 missed calls and 2 voicemails. By noon, a bouquet arrived, white lilies and peonies wrapped in silk ribbon, with a card that read, "Let's talk, please." I didn't know what to say, but I know I want you. I stared at the flowers for a long time. They sat too perfectly in the entryway, like a placeholder for something that never belonged. I didn't call back. Not that day, not any day after. He kept trying. A week passed, then 2. Texts, emails, late-night apologies. One message read, "I spoke to my mum, she didn't mean it the way it sounded." Another, "We can start over, just us. I promise I'll protect you this time." It might have worked once, I might have wanted that once. But now, the apology came too late. And it wasn't about protecting me. It was about erasing what had already been revealed. Sophia never said, "I told you so." She let me sit with it. Let me sift through the ache and silence without labelling it. One night, after we'd closed the blinds and turned off the living room lamp, she handed me a notebook. "Just sketches," she said, "for fun, or maybe more." Inside were rough pencil drawings, costumes, concepts, characters we used to dream up when I was a teen. I traced the lines, remembered how I used to imagine owning a tiny studio sewing until my fingers hurt, but my heart felt whole. "What if we opened something?" Sophia asked, casual but steady. "Small, local, costumes rentals, custom work. You do the art, I handle the rest." I blinked. Like a real shop. Why not? It felt ridiculous. We had no money, no space. I hadn't drawn seriously in months. But something about the idea stuck to my ribs. A seed in my chest I hadn't realised was still alive. We started slow. Research, calls. An old friend let us use the back of her photography studio for cheap. The first week we organised the space. Brought in a thrifted dress from a used Singer machine bolts of discounted fabric. The lighting was bad, the paint on the walls chipped, but it was ours. I was rusty at first, my stitches uneven, my confidence worse. I second-guessed every design, every seam. But Sophia never rushed me. She handled the permits, the bills, the social media page with a homemade logo and a tagline that read, "Stories Stitched." And slowly, my hands remembered. The thread steadied. The colours came back to me. One morning, while pinning a sleeve on a velvet gown, I caught my reflection in the studio mirror, hair tied up, face bare, hoodie stained with chalk. And I smiled. Not the kind you force. The kind that bubbles up when you realise you're exactly where you're meant to be. But not every day felt like that. Some mornings I woke up and doubted everything, wondered if I had made a mistake, if walking away meant I had failed. The bills came fast, the orders came slow. There were nights we split a cup of noodles and laughed because crying would take too much energy. One night, while sorting through a bag of donated scraps, I pulled out a piece of blue fabric with tiny embroidered stars. It reminded me of a dress I had as a kid, one Sophia had found at a yard sale and stayed up all night adjusting so it would fit me for the school recital. That dress made me feel like magic. Not because it was expensive, but because someone believed I was worth the effort. I looked at the fabric and realised that belief hadn't died. It had just been buried under too many compromises. A week later, a local school reached out. They were doing a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream and needed help. I stayed up 2 nights straight, stitching fairy wings and romantic tunics. On the final night, a student walked in to try on his costume. He looked at himself, turned once and said, "I feel like someone else, but in a good way." That was it, the reason I started all this. Julian's last message came 2 months later. A long email, reflective, careful. He said he understood why I left, said he was sorry he didn't speak up when it mattered, that he hoped I was building something beautiful. I didn't reply, not because I hated him, but because I didn't owe closure to someone who had watched me shrink. Every day wasn't easy, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. A few months later, something started to shift, not dramatically, quietly, like a ripple becoming a wave. Our little shop began to attract attention. A local blogger posted about our costumes. Then, a mum from the school production told her book club. A community theatre director stopped by one afternoon, sipping iced coffee and scribbling on a notepad. "You did the fairy wings for midsummer?" he asked. I nodded. He grinned. "Good. I need 20 flapper dresses by March." From there, the calls didn't stop. Our evenings turned into fittings. Our weekends became design marathons. Sophia kept track of orders in a colour-coded spreadsheet, and I worked late into the night, stitching hems, while a fan blew warm air through the cracked window. The walls of our tiny studio were still chipped, but now they were covered with sketches, swatches, inspiration boards. It didn't look perfect, but it looked alive. One afternoon, a woman walked in, young mid-20s, shaved head, and silver hoops holding a worn leather folder. "I'm directing a piece," she said. "It's a reinterpretation of fairy tales, about women who don't wait to be saved." She laid out her concept. Red Riding Hood leads a revolution. Rapunzel climbs down her own tower. Cinderella burns the slipper. "It's about reclamation," she said, "about refusing to be cast in someone else's version of you." I paused, hand resting on the edge of the cutting table. Then I smiled. "I used to be one of them," I said, "but I'm not playing that role anymore." We got to work. Each costume in that show was stitched with something more than thread. Every piece felt like a quiet rebellion, a personal manifesto. There was a cloak lined with hidden words from banned books, a ball gown made from torn suits, a cape that shimmered like armour but moved like silk. The process was intense, long nights changes at the last minute fitting issues. But I loved every second of it. The young director, her name was Maren, was unlike anyone I'd worked with. She asked questions like, "What does liberation look like in fabric?" And "If grief had a texture, what would it feel like to wear it?" It challenged me, not just as a designer, but as a woman who had spent years dressing herself in what others expected. We would sit on the studio floor after long days eating takeout and talking about the characters we used to love. Maren told me how as a kid she hated how the princesses always waited. "I used to scream at the TV," she said, laughing, like, "Girl, you have legs, run." And I remembered something too, a night when I was maybe 10. Sophia and I were lying on a shared mattress, the fan humming above us. I had asked her why fairy tales were always about finding someone to love you. She had replied, "Maybe because people forget love starts with yourself. If I were Cinderella, I'd throw that glass shoe at the carriage and walk away barefoot." The opening night of Maren's play was standing room only. Sophia and I stood at the back, pressed shoulder to shoulder. When the cast took their bows, I didn't feel pride so much as peace, like something that had fractured was slowly knitting itself whole again. After the show, a woman approached us. She introduced herself as a scout from a regional arts foundation. She was looking for designers to highlight in an upcoming exhibit on modern costume storytelling. "Are you the creator?" she asked, eyes on Sophia. I opened my mouth, then paused. Sophia laughed. "Oh no, I just handle the mess." But the woman insisted, "Your energy, it feels like the soul of this place." I could have corrected her, said it was my sketchbook, my stitching, my hours bent over fabric. But I didn't, because she was right in a way. Sophia was the soul. She had carried me when I forgot how to walk, held the frame steady while I rebuilt the picture. I smiled. Let the moment settle. We both deserved the light. Later that night, we closed the shop and walked home in the dark. The sidewalk was cracked. The air smelled like rain. We didn't say much, just walked side by side towards something that felt like a future finally built on our own terms. 2 weeks later, Maren invited us to an art gallery opening downtown, a curated exhibit called Threaded Voices. She said some of my designs from the fairy tale show would be featured. I hesitated at first. We had orders to finish. Rent was due. But Sophia didn't give me a choice. "You need to see what happens when you stop hiding," she said, shoving my nicer boots at me. The gallery was in a refurbished warehouse, strung with bare bulbs and white curtains. Soft jazz floated underfoot. Walls gleamed with sketches, fibre installations, even sculpted mannequins wrapped in textile poetry. Near the entrance, I spotted one of my gowns, the Cinderella burn dress. Layers of grey chiffon scorched at the hem, sequins stitched like shattered glass. Underneath was a placard, Eleanor Rivera Storyteller, through thread. I stood there longer than I meant to. When I finally turned, I saw him. Julian, alone, standing beneath a piece made of rusted corset wire and broken mirror shards. His posture was familiar, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly down, hands in the pockets of his expensive coat. Still polished, still measured. My stomach didn't twist. My breath didn't catch. Just a quiet recognition, like passing an old apartment you no longer live in. He looked up and saw me. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a smile. "Eleanor," he said, crossing the room, "this is impressive, really." I gave a polite nod. "Thanks, it's been a busy few months." "You've changed," he said, tilting his head. "There's something different about you." I let the words rest between us. The old me would have filled the silence, but I'd learned that silence can speak too. "No," I said calmly. "I just stopped shrinking." His expression faltered. A moment of real discomfort. I recognized it, not anger, but the confusion of someone who no longer knows the script. We drifted into small talk. He asked about the shop, I asked about his job. He was seeing someone new, a marketing director. He mentioned her with care, the way you speak of someone you haven't decided to love yet. I wished her well in my head. Then he got quiet. He looked at me like we were still sitting at his parents' table, like the night hadn't ended with a broken toast. "I didn't know how to love you then," he said, voice low. "Not really." I met his eyes. And I didn't know how to love myself yet either. That was the real problem. He nodded. "You deserved more." "I found it," I said simply. "Not from someone else, from me." There it was, the closure he never gave, the permission I no longer needed. My phone buzzed Sophia. I told him goodbye and walked out into the cool night. As I crossed the street, I passed the window of a bakery just about to close. Something about the smell, warm dough sugar cinnamon, felt like home. I stepped inside and bought 2 pastries. The clerk looked at my coat. "Did you make that yourself?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "For me." Outside, I sat on a bench and waited for Sophia. The city glowed in puddles at my feet. I remembered the last night I saw Julian, before the break, packing my things while he stood in the hallway silent. He'd whispered, "You're overreacting." I hadn't answered then, but I had now. Sophia arrived 10 minutes later, cheeks flushed from walking fast. She saw the second pastry and grinned. "You always know what I need." "No," I said, handing it to her. "I just remember who remembered me first." We walked home under the flicker of a streetlight's crumbs on our fingers, no words needed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt complete without explanation. The next morning, Sophia arrived early, balancing 2 coffees and a garment bag that looked heavier than usual. She set it down on the work table with a small thud and handed me a cup. "New client," she said, a half smile playing on her face. "She wants something bold, for a character who won't bow." The zipper slid open like a secret revealing itself. Inside was a bolt of crimson silk, so rich it looked like it had been dyed in defiance. I ran my hand across the fabric, slowly feeling the weight of its texture. This wasn't the kind of fabric you worked with casually. It demanded your full presence. It didn't whisper. It roared. Sophia watched me quietly. I could tell she already knew what I was thinking, that this dress wasn't just for a client. It was for every version of me that had once been told to sit quietly, to blend in, to be less. I sat down, sunlight warming the edge of the table. The shop was quiet. Just the low hum of a distant car and the clinking of Sophia organising hangers in the back. I didn't reach for the machine. Something still asked to be sewn by hand. Threading the needle was slower now, not because I was uncertain, but because I cared more. Every movement carried weight. I wasn't just making a costume. I was shaping a story. As I worked, I remembered the first time I saw Sophia in a red dress. I was 13. She had borrowed it for a school function, something she had no time or money for, but she went anyway. She walked into that gymnasium like it owed her grace. I remember watching from the hallway, peeking through the glass. One of the other mums whispered something cruel, something about trying too hard. Sophia didn't flinch. She just laughed, loudly, like she had earned the right to be there. Back then, I had been embarrassed. I wished she would disappear. Now I wished I had a photo of that moment to frame. "You know," I said to Sophia without looking up, "this fabric reminds me of you." She chuckled. "Stubborn and expensive." I smiled. Undeniable. She went back to sorting, but I could feel her pride in the silence that followed. The dress began to take shape, strong lines, unapologetic angles, a neckline that didn't ask for permission. I wasn't designing for fantasy anymore. I was designing for the kind of woman who knew what it cost to take up space and chose to anyway. After Sophia left for a fitting, I stayed behind. The late afternoon light stretched across the floor, golden and slow. I brewed a small pot of tea and sat by the window with my sketchbook. Flipping back through the pages, I found an old note scribbled in the margin. Maybe one day. I had written it years ago, before the shop, before Julian, before I knew what it meant to live life on your own terms. I touched the words gently. That girl hadn't disappeared. She had just grown into herself. A few minutes later, a young woman came in, barely 20 eyes, sharp posture, defensive. She looked around the studio like she expected not to belong. "Can I help you?" I asked, standing. She hesitated. "Then I heard you make things that feel like they belong to the person wearing them." I nodded. "That's the idea." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath all day. "I have this interview, and I want to walk in feeling like I already own the room." I smiled and gestured her over. "Let's talk about who you are, and we'll build from there." Later, as I returned to the crimson dress, I tied off the final knot and clipped the thread. That small motion, the snip of scissors, the sound of thread releasing felt symbolic. Not an ending, a marking of passage. Because I didn't need applause. I didn't need permission. I didn't need a title or a table I had to fight to sit at. I was the table. I had built the room. Have you ever walked away from something that looked perfect because you refused to apologise for who you are? Tell me. Someone out there might need to hear your steps. And if you're still standing at that doorway between who you were told to be and who you know you are, I want you to hear this. You're not alone. So many of us were taught to make ourselves smaller, just to keep the peace, to fit in, to be loved. But the truth is, real peace never asks you to shrink. Right now, there are people like you quietly rebuilding themselves, one decision, one boundary, one honest moment at a time. Some do it in therapy, some through journaling or long walks or late night talks with a friend who really sees them. Some like me do it with thread and fabric, piecing back the parts that were once unravelled. However you begin, start small. Start soft, but start. Because healing isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It just needs to be yours. And if this story spoke to something inside you, if it felt like someone finally put your feelings into words, stay. Subscribe. There are more stories coming. Stories of quiet strength of women who broke the script and chose themselves. You belong here. We all do.